Since the start of this podcast, we have been covering tube jig heads and how many different styles and sizes there are on the market and that we carry ourselves. We had talked about this week we were going to discuss the different hook styles and points, but we realized that we needed to back up a second and we needed to cover, although we covered 60s versus 90s, we needed to cover the style of head.
So, welcome in everyone to the Level Up Fishing Podcast. And yes, we're going to talk more about tube jig head design today because we do feel like there's still a lot of questions out there about why there are so many different head styles in relation to the line tie. It gets a little bit confusing, and we add to that confusion because we do a lot of different techniques with tube jigs that aren't necessarily straightforward or textbook. And so we've come up with heads that match our fishing style, but we wanted to talk a little more about the techniques involved and why we do what we do.
I know when we first started building our own tubes and Andy was designing all of the different styles, I was like, why? Why do we need so many different molds? Why are there so many different styles? So this is a topic I think a lot of people could benefit from.
So, of course, the main thing that we do with our tube heads that's different from everyone else is the hooks, which we will cover in more detail next time because the hooks really drive everything we've done. Getting the proper hook for, the fish of a lifetime is everything.
Yeah.
And so today, though, we want to talk a little bit more about our head styles and really when you look at like a standard or a short or even our heavy wire tube jig heads, those are pretty straightforward. The 90-degree cylinder shapes will fish your tube in a horizontal fashion. The 60-degree, more teardrop shaped lead heads will fish in kind of a nose down situation. It's really when you get into the big ones that things change a lot. And so we wanted to bring that info to you guys so that hopefully it makes a little more sense.
We can't just ever follow the rules, can we?
So the rage the last several years has been, we'll just call them Tora tubes, just to keep it simple. But basically what we're talking about are plastic tube jigs that are range anywhere from 5 up to even 12 or 13 inches long, that a lot of them have like a very big profile and they're really big around. So we're just calling those Tora tubes. And we always think about lake trout when we're fishing with that style bait, but they're also very well suited for pike and muskie. It's definitely a big predator bait. And so the heads we built for such a critter took a lot more design and practice to get the balance of them that we wanted. So we still wanted to be able to bring to the market something that would give you a nose down profile or a horizontal profile, depending on what your preferred technique is. And so we'll start with we call it the mega tube. It's actually it's like a saltwater Popeye jig is what like the mold is that we use. But again, we're using a big predator style hook in there. And the reason we picked that particular head style was it's a very large diameter lead head. And so it fits the profile of those Tora tubes really well. We use an 8/0 hook in it, so you get like proper line tie placement and hook placement with the tube body, kind of a all in one deal, so it fits right. But the main thing with a mega tube that we want to tell you about is that thing actually is built to fish a Tora tube horizontal.
Now, okay, when you look at that tube head, just the tube jig head, not rigged, it doesn't look like it would fish horizontal.
So that's a good point. It doesn't. And that's what took a long time in getting the right head design and profile and weight and all of that. When you're trying to balance a large piece of plastic, it doesn't act the same as a standard sized tube jig does. The large profile, the large diameter, the fact that really no Tora tubes on the market use salt in the plastic, that whole bait is just far more buoyant, and it on its own it actually wants to sit horizontal. So if you're trying to put really any weight in front of the line tie, it's going to make it nose down. So yeah, looking at the mega tube, it doesn't look like it would fish horizontal at all, but through all of our trial and research the last couple of years, we got that one to where you might have to position the line tie, poke it out of the tube jig body and maybe drop it in the water and check it a couple times and move it forward or back in the body of the tube to get the perfect balance, but you can easily with the mega tube.
Yeah.
So that brings us to the product that we released last year called the Grave Digger, and this is really kind of our favorite one. It's a very unconventional mold that we used and modified heavily to make this thing do what we want it to do.
It started out as a drawing on the very table we are sitting at right now.
Yeah, it was a sketch, and in my mind, we get asked all the time, if you were gonna lake trout fish, how do you want to do it? And I personally would probably just troll for them all the time or cast to them all the time, but there's a time and a place where 100% bottom contact presentation is how you catch them. That's definitely probably the most tried and true technique, whether it's vertical or trolling or whatever you're doing. If you can keep your lure in the bottom of the lake, your success ratio goes way up. Mm-hmm. So to go along with the whole Tora tube craze, which happened for a reason, those large tube jigs attract large fish. It's like big bait, big fish. It, for the most part, holds true with large predators like lake trout, pike, and muskie. So because of the odd balance characteristics of Tora tubes, even using our heavy wires and the mega tubes, I just couldn't get the technique I wanted. So we came up with the Grave Digger so that you can do this technique that's really my favorite. If we're going to jig for lake trout, this is what I'm doing. Mm-hmm. And so we've had other customers across the nation like pick up on this without us even talking about it really much. And generically, maybe it's called I would call it like a drop and drag technique, or I call it troll jigging, because you're keeping the boat in constant motion, typically very slow, but you can do it fast. That's why we make that Grave Digger up to 4 ounces, is because it'll allow you to, keep that lure at the bottom of the lake and pull it really, really fast like you would trolling, but it just gives you a totally different look than you would get with like any hard bait or any swim bait or anything like that. So there's actually a lot going on with that technique. It seems pretty simple, but the Grave Digger is designed to fish like what we described like a 60-degree head to fish like. Mm-hmm. The Grave Digger it gives a big Tora tube a very nose down presentation.
But yeah, it looks like it would be a horizontal tube jig head.
So yeah, to add to the confusion of just looking at it and trying to decide what it's supposed to do, It's on a 90-degree hook, and it looks like the lead is, it's not a cylinder shape per se, but it's that same sort of profile. But because of the weight characteristics of a Tora tube, when we pour all that lead kind of down and in front of the line tie, it takes a lot of weight out in front of the line tie to get a Tora tube to nose down. And the reason I want it to do that is, the reason we call it a grave digger is that thing's trying to dig a hole in the bottom of the lake.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you have your boat going across the structure, what you can visualize on that is, the nose of that bait's just constantly just digging up dirt and muck and creating a big commotion in the water that attracts a lot of fish. And so because it's nose down and not horizontal, you can control it, you can feel it, and it digs up way more debris than trying to do that technique with a head that leaves your jig horizontal. And then the last part of that too is that because the nose of it's digging down, it lifts the hook point a little farther up off the bottom. So it makes the fish, it lets the fish get a hold of the bait easier. He doesn't have to suck up a bunch of dirt and stuff along with it to get it in his mouth. And it also is relatively snag free. You can certainly wedge the front of that jig into like a rock pile or something and get it stuck, but the hook actually stays out of the debris and out of the rocks and brush and stuff way better because the nose of it's down, so it's making the hook stay up.
So, okay. It's no secret that you and I both prefer open water fishing. We love open water fishing. It is our favorite. But we live in Gunnison, Colorado, and that is not always an option. And we have a huge following of people who absolutely love ice fishing. We do love ice fishing as well. So let's talk about the grave digger during ice season. Tell me, what would you do with it?
So, great question. The first thing people kind of like about the grave digger and the mega tube is that they fit the profile of a Tora tube. It's got the right length to it to where the hook comes out, usually where the tentacles start on a tube body. So for one, it physically fits a Tora tube better. But if we want to talk technique wise, again, if you're running a Tora tube and you want it to sit horizontal, which for the most part is the kind of preferred method when vertical jigging, which also includes ice jigging, the mega tube's going to hold that thing horizontal for you. But the grave digger serves a really good purpose through the ice as well. One thing that you will always note about lake trout is they're highly visual predators, and they're very curious predators. And so we like to employ the technique that we call pounding the bottom. And because the gravedigger nose is down, you basically just send your jig to the bottom of the lake and then lift it 2 or 3 feet off the bottom and then just let it fall as fast as it wants to on a slack line and slam it into the bottom of the lake bed. And then that's going to create a lot of noise. It's going to create a lot of silt and debris and stuff starting to fly around.
Vibration, yeah.
Lots of vibration. And just the motion even from that giant Tora tube lifting and falling and lifting and falling is going to call in fish from a long ways. They can see really well under the ice. You'd be surprised how many big lake trout we've been able to watch with the live scope come in from over 100 feet away when you start doing this pounding the bottom technique, because they hear it, they feel it, they see it, and they gotta come over there and see what it's all about.
Yeah, they are curious.
So one thing to note about that is the nose down sort of technique with the gravedigger head. Kind of at the same time, it's a really, really good head to use to call fish to you but it's not necessarily how we actually catch them.
Mm-hmm.
So we get those things called over to us, and we always have a second rod in a hole very close to the hole that we're using to pound the bottom. And so if we catch a fish coming in to investigate on our electronics, a lot of times we'll stop pounding the bottom with that big heavy grave digger, and we'll get our hands on the other rod that's got probably a 4 or 5 inch tube with our heavy wire jig head in it, with that supernatural horizontal presentation. And what happens there is there's so much commotion and debris and stuff kind of floating around in the water around both of those jigs that lake trout's getting in there and he's super curious about what's going on. And so he's just going to see that one horizontal presentation just kind of sitting there, but he's not going to be able to get a really good look at it because there's so much debris and stuff floating around. And so that's a super good way to trick them. The only thing they have left to do at that point is put it in its mouth and investigate it that way because he can't see it. So there's another, that's like a kind of the old guide trick or whatever you want to call it. But that's how we've caught a ton of big lake trout over the years ice fishing, doing just that. You call them in and then you trick them into biting by sort of hiding your presentation, because we know how picky those things can be when you're trying to catch them through the ice. And so anything you can do to kind of disguise what you're doing, the better off you're going to be.
And I mean, especially those big ones, they're old, they're not dumb. They've seen a few things in their time, you know? So if they see these horizontal jigs, sometimes they don't want to. So in previous episodes, we talked about, planing them out and how to use tube jigs in different ways. It's not just lifting up and dropping it down, lifting up and dropping it down, but it's using it in several different ways, which makes it way more effective. And I think the other key point that anglers really need to realize is that these tube jig heads, I almost call them just tubes, but tube jig heads are designed to be fished with a tube. So you can look at them on the shelf and think, okay, but you really got to visualize what is it going to be paired with? What size of tube? Are you going to use a salted tube? Are you going to use an unsalted tube? Because all of those things matter when you break it down.
All very good points, yes. And to not forget about the other big predators that we created these heads around. Again, a tube has been around for ages, and it's really one of the top producing soft plastic lures ever made. And when we start talking about Tora tubes, the other species we like to target with them is pike and muskie. And again, with those, there are times when those fish really react well to a really hyper erratic presentation with something big. And so we would use something like our grave digger to do, get a really heavy one, like 3 or 4 ounce grave digger in a big 8-inch tube, and throw it out there and almost like jerk it around like a jerk bait. And the other thing, if they're not reacting to real erratic stuff, the other way to catch them is the next best thing they like is something that's very, very steady. And so if you can use the mega tube on that same big Tora tube and really just throw it out and reel it in, suspended or on the bottom or fast across the top, because that mega tube, because it's keeping it horizontal in the water column, that thing's going to come back to you on a straight retrieve at a very steady, even pace with hardly any up, down, side to side motion. And a lot of times that's when those pike and muskie get really engaged in a presentation, and then you do the classic figure eight at the boat when they get up there and hadn't committed, but they're still following. So there's still, there's a lot of other fish other than lake trout that you can catch with these things, and there's a couple more techniques to think about there.
Yeah, I think big profiled tubes are the perfect decoy. And even if you can't get them to bite it, then that's when you have another rod with something like a finesse jig or, a jerk bait, but it helps get them called in, get their attention. I think there's a lot of ways that anglers can use them that maybe they hadn't tried before. That's why our grave diggers go up to 4 ounces. That's a big tube, but we use it as a decoy. It helps us pound the bottom. It helps us with the vibration. It helps with a lot of things, and that's why we have such a big size tube. Jig head. I'm never, ever, ever going to get that right, guys. I call them tubes, and I should be calling them tube jig heads. So I apologize. Okay, now next week we will officially be talking about the hooks that we picked.
I love talking about hooks because it is absolutely what matters the most out of all of this stuff.
Yeah.
It's where we started this whole thing because I was sick and tired of there being stuff on the market that couldn't hold up to a 30-pound lake trout. It couldn't catch browns. It couldn't, like, it was just driving me bananas. So we spent years going rounds with different companies, and I can cover them all because I've been in the industry for over 20 years. I'm familiar with all the hook brands out there. We've used all of them. And so if you're ready to get a ton of information that you don't know that you needed, on the next episode when we talk about hooks, there's going to be a lot of stuff coming at you that is actually super cool info that I learned a ton going through all of this, and it's really helped our catch rates skyrocket.
It matters. The hook really, really matters. Dull points, hook sets, people who struggle with hook sets. Oh my gosh, it's going to be good, guys. We're excited. So keep listening to the Level Up Fishing Podcast. Stay tuned for next week.
We will see you on the water.